What if I told you that being deeply self-aware isn't a gift, but something society treats like a threat? What if the very qualities that allow you to see clearly, empathy, introspection, intellectual honesty, are the same ones that isolate you from the world? Imagine this. A child questions the meaning of rules while others memorize them. A teenager feels the emotional undercurrents of every conversation while their peers laugh at surface jokes. An adult walks into a room and senses the tension no one speaks about and is told they're too sensitive, not because they're broken, but because they're awake in a world that prefers sleep. These aren't troubled individuals. They're emotionally intelligent, reflective people who feel things others avoid. People Carl Jung would say are simply more conscious than the collective norm. And here's the disturbing part. The more conscious you become, the more alienated you often feel. It doesn't just happen to loners or outsiders. It happens to artists, thinkers, healers, people like you and me. People who, without meaning to, expose the illusions others depend on just to get through the day. And the reaction? Society pushes them away. Not violently, but subtly, through mockery, through rejection, through the constant message, "You're too much." Not because they're wrong, but because they're mirrors. And mirrors are dangerous in a world built on pretending. In 1957, Carl Jung wrote about what he called mass-mindedness, a cultural force that teaches people not to think, not to question, not to feel. From childhood, we are taught to be likable, not truthful, to conform, not awaken, to smile, even when we're dying inside. And the deeper you go into your own mind, the more this tension grows. Because you begin to realize the system isn't just flawed, it's designed to keep you from becoming who you truly are. This is exactly what Jung warned us about, and it's what every deep thinker eventually collides with. But before we go deeper, let me ask you, have you ever stayed silent, not because you had nothing to say, but because you knew the truth would scare people away? Hold that thought, because what we're about to explore might be one of the most uncomfortable and liberating truths you've ever faced. Carl Jung wasn't a detached academic theorizing from a distance. He was a psychiatrist who spent his life looking into the darkest corners of the human mind, both individually and collectively. Born in 1875 in Switzerland, Jung came from a lineage of pastors and thinkers. He could have easily stayed in the comfort of traditional psychology. But what he saw, again and again, was that the biggest threat to human growth wasn't ignorance, but unconsciousness. Not the absence of knowledge, but the refusal to look within. Jung watched as people who seemed functional, polished, educated, spiritual, collapsed under the weight of their own repressed truths. They weren't broken from birth. They had simply learned from an early age that the world didn't want their depth. That silence was safer than honesty. That pretending was rewarded more than feeling. In a society obsessed with speed, productivity, and superficial harmony, Jung noticed something deeply unsettling. The most aware individuals were often the most isolated, not because they were strange, but because they saw what others refused to see. They felt what others ran from, and in doing so, they became dangerous, not to themselves, but to the illusion. From his writings emerged one of his most piercing insights. Loneliness does not come from being alone, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you. What made this truth so tragic wasn't its poetry, but its accuracy. Depth, in our culture, isn't supported, it's suppressed. The world doesn't need to censor your truth. It only needs to exhaust you until you stop trying to express it, not through force, but through performance, through systems that reward obedience, triviality, and emotional detachment. And this is not accidental. Modern institutions, from schools to corporations to social media, are not designed for the soul. They are designed for conformity. Jung saw it clearly. The unconscious society doesn't fear monsters, it fears mirrors. And that's exactly what deep thinkers are. Mirrors that reflect everything we've avoided. And for that reason, they are often pushed to the margins, not because they are wrong, but because they are awake. When Carl Jung spoke of alienation, he wasn't talking about loneliness in the ordinary sense. He was describing something far more unsettling, the psychological isolation that arises when someone becomes truly conscious in a world that isn't. In his writings, Jung explained, loneliness does not come from being alone, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you. And here's what made Jung's insight so revolutionary. He argued that this alienation doesn't stem from some personal defect, but from cultural forces that make inner depth feel dangerous and even shameful. From childhood, people are rewarded not for honesty, but for agreeableness, not for insight, but for obedience, not for emotional clarity, but for silence. The result? Most people never learn how to think inwardly. They learn to perform, to conform. They learn that to ask, "Why am I doing this?" is to risk rejection, and so they stop asking. But here's what Jung understood long before modern psychology confirmed it. This suppression isn't accidental, it's systemic. Our institutions actively discourage depth. Schools reward memorization over introspection. Workplaces prize compliance over creativity. Social media celebrates surface-level positivity while punishing complexity. This creates not just external pressure, but internal fragmentation. People are taught to edit their emotions, censor their thoughts, flatten their depth, not to survive reality, but to survive social approval. And the result is devastating for those who can't flatten themselves, the deep thinkers, the emotionally attuned, the ones who feel what others ignore and see what others deny. Jung believed these individuals often suffer most, not because they are broken, but because they are mirrors. And in a society built on avoidance, mirrors are terrifying. So what happens? The world doesn't attack them directly. It isolates them subtly, labels them too intense, too sensitive, too serious. Not because they're wrong, but because they're awake. Carl Jung observed that alienation isn't merely a personal issue, it's a cultural and collective phenomenon. It becomes clear, Jung wrote in his later work, that the more one individuates, the more one risks separation from the collective. What he noticed was that individuals who begin to see clearly, who awaken emotionally and psychologically, often find themselves exiled, not because they've done anything wrong, but because the group can no longer tolerate their depth. This insight would later be echoed in modern psychology. In the 1950s, Solomon Asch's experiments demonstrated that 75% of people conform to obviously wrong answers when placed in group settings, just to avoid standing out. Jung had seen this long before the data confirmed it. He understood that most people don't fear being wrong, they fear being isolated. Now, imagine how this plays out today. We live in a world that encourages constant performance, on social media, in schools, at work. And anyone who dares to speak about emotional pain, unspoken truths, or psychological nuance is quickly told, "You're being too negative. You're overthinking. Just be normal." But here's the core of Jung's insight. Groupthink doesn't just suppress ideas, it suppresses souls. It punishes those who feel deeply and question sincerely, and it rewards those who conform, perform, and distract themselves from themselves. Have you ever noticed how hard it is to talk about something real in a group setting? How silence falls when you name something that doesn't fit the emotional script? That's not just awkwardness, it's social self-defense. The group protects itself by rejecting the individual who breaks the illusion. We've seen this pattern for centuries. Religious mystics labeled as heretics, philosophers dismissed as mad, artists called unstable, not because they lacked insight, but because they had too much. In Jungian terms, these were individuals confronting the shadow, not only their own, but society's. And when you reflect what others are trying to avoid, they don't thank you. They exclude you. Because in a world addicted to comfort and image, the real threat isn't violence, it's clarity. If the world is designed to suppress depth, how do we stay true to ourselves? Carl Jung believed the answer wasn't comfort, it was inner work. What he called individuation, the painful, courageous process of becoming whole, even when it means standing alone. But now we understand it's not just emotional rejection we're up against. It's a global system of distractions. It's a culture that rewards performance over presence. It's billions of dollars invested in keeping you numb, compliant, and reactive. So how do deep thinkers resist? Not by escaping the world, but by refusing to abandon their own soul within it. Here are a few daily practices that serve as quiet acts of rebellion in a culture that fears reflection. First, protect your stillness. Even 10 minutes of silence, no screens, no performance, no pressure, can reconnect you to yourself. Stillness is not laziness. It's where your real voice returns. Second, resist the need to be understood. Not everyone will meet you in your depth, and that's okay. Jung believed that individuation requires withdrawal from the collective. Let go of the idea that truth needs applause. It doesn't. It just needs guardians. Third, ask deeper questions. When you're about to react or judge, pause. Ask, what am I actually feeling? What's beneath the surface? This isn't overthinking, it's clarity. Fourth, create what you wish existed. Whether it's art, writing, conversation, or just your way of being. Express what others are afraid to say. Every authentic act is a crack in the collective illusion. But let's be honest, individual practices, while powerful, are not enough. We also need spaces, digital and real, where depth is not punished, but protected. We need education that values introspection as much as memorization. We need social norms that make emotional honesty less dangerous and more human. And more than anything, we need to stop pathologizing the pain of those who feel too much. Because that pain is not weakness, it's awareness. Jung believed that society evolves only when individuals are brave enough to stay awake, even when sleep would be easier. So if you felt too intense, too honest, too different, remember this: your existence is not the problem. Your depth is the medicine. Now the question is, will you keep hiding it? Or will you finally let it become who you are? Jung's theory was radical for its time, but here's what even he couldn't have predicted. This isn't just about emotional repression or cultural performance. Modern life is now neurologically and technologically engineered to suppress inner depth. Think about it. Jung observed how modern individuals were being pulled away from their inner lives by external noise and collective expectations. But today, we're facing something exponentially more invasive. He lived in a world of books, letters, and in-person conversations. We live in a world of algorithmic manipulation, digital surveillance, and dopamine-driven platforms designed to hijack our attention and flatten our inner lives. This isn't just about culture anymore. It's about the architecture of your nervous system being rewired for emotional numbness. Here's the unsettling truth. Our minds weren't built for constant noise. They evolved to process silence, symbols, dreams, and depth. But the world we've built now punishes exactly those things. It trains your brain to scroll past meaning, to avoid silence, to treat reflection like a threat. And here's where Jung's insight becomes more urgent than ever. When people feel psychologically unsafe, when they're overwhelmed, exhausted, or emotionally disconnected, they don't seek truth. They seek relief. They default to superficial comfort, even if it means abandoning their real self. This is why so many emotionally intelligent people now feel more tired than ever. Not because they're broken, but because they're awake in a system that is optimized for unconsciousness. And it's not just social, it's neural. Every notification you check, every scroll, every carefully designed interface is training your brain to fear stillness. And the more attuned you are, the more deeply you feel the drain. We saw this during the pandemic, during political upheavals, during social media outrage cycles. People who once valued meaning and truth began numbing themselves with noise. Not because they wanted to lose themselves, but because depth became too painful to carry in a world that doesn't hold space for it. That's the terrifying evolution Jung couldn't have seen. We're no longer just fighting cultural pressure to conform. We're fighting engineered systems that target the soul's need for silence, for shadow work, for real inner life. So the question now is no longer, how do I become more conscious? It's, how do I stay conscious in a world designed to put me back to sleep? They're often called too serious, too intense, too sensitive, but what they really are is awake. And in a world that rewards pretense over presence, that's not a compliment. It's a threat. Carl Jung spent his life exploring what happens when a person refuses to betray their inner world just to belong to the outer one. He saw that emotional awareness, inner honesty, and silence weren't luxuries. They were the foundations of the soul. And when a society suppresses these things, something far more devastating happens than political corruption or social unrest. People stop being themselves. They stop thinking deeply. They stop feeling fully. They become, in Jung's words, fragments of a collective mind, afraid of their own shadow. But here's what makes this insight even more relevant today. Who stands fast? When vulnerability is mocked, when silence is mistaken for weakness, when truth costs more than image, who still dares to be real? The answer isn't found in philosophical genius or spiritual perfection. It's found in the ordinary choice to remain emotionally honest when everyone else is pretending. To ask why when the world says, just follow. To feel what's real, even when it hurts. These aren't dramatic acts. They're quiet ones. Pauses in a conversation where you don't fake a laugh. Moments where you choose solitude over shallow approval. The decision to speak truth gently, even if no one claps. The tragedy is that emotional numbness often feels like relief. It's easier to scroll than to reflect, easier to agree than to confront, easier to be liked than to be seen. But Jung believed that this comfort is the cost of losing your soul. Because in a world that thrives on emotional suppression, staying true to yourself becomes a radical act. And here's the most uncomfortable truth of all. We're all tempted to abandon our depth. The moment we convince ourselves we no longer need silence, stillness, or sorrow, we've already started to forget who we are. The price of emotional freedom is not a grand revelation. It's daily vigilance, not against others, but against the subtle pull to become a version of ourselves the world finds easier to digest. Jung's insight into the pain of self-awareness is unsettling precisely because it's so accurate. We see it everywhere. Emotionally intelligent people doubting themselves, deep thinkers shrinking their truth to fit in, sensitive individuals called too much for simply naming what others pretend not to feel. The problem isn't that people are becoming less capable of feeling. It's that our culture rewards emotional suppression over inner honesty, distraction over reflection, performance over presence. But within this sobering diagnosis lies something powerful. If emotional numbness is something we learn, then we can also unlearn it. If isolation is the price of truth, then authentic connection is still possible. And if the world has trained us to avoid our depth, we can train ourselves to return to it. Think of emotional clarity like a muscle. It's uncomfortable to activate at first, especially in a culture built on image and approval, but it's essential for wholeness. Just like you wouldn't expect to build physical strength without resistance, you can't expect to reclaim your soul without discomfort. So here's the challenge. The next time you feel the urge to apologize for your sensitivity, the next time you silence a truth because you think it might make others uncomfortable, the next time you're tempted to smile when something inside you is aching, pause. That moment is your chance, not to withdraw into fear, but to reclaim yourself quietly, gently, courageously. Jung warned that most people don't think, they perform. Most people don't feel, they react. But if you've made it this far, you already know. You weren't meant to perform. You were meant to become. This world is designed to distract you from yourself, to flatten your complexity into a brand, to call your depth too intense until you believe it's a flaw. But here's what I want you to remember. Every time you choose truth over image, silence over noise, self-awareness over social approval, you're not just healing yourself. You're keeping something sacred alive. Here's my challenge to you. This week, notice one moment where you're tempted to betray your emotional truth. Don't fight it. Just stay present. Breathe through it. Let it speak. Not to dramatize, not to prove anything, but to practice what Jung called individuation, the daily, imperfect work of becoming whole in a world that wants you fragmented. If this message stirred something in you, that's not weakness. That's the beginning of emotional integrity. Share this with someone who feels deeply. Who sees through the noise? Who's tired of pretending? Because in a world designed to keep you asleep, the simple act of feeling deeply is one of the most radical things you can do. Now tell me, what's one emotion you've been taught to suppress that you're ready to reclaim this week? Let's remind the world that depth isn't dysfunction. It's a kind of wisdom. And maybe, just maybe, the future of human dignity depends on people like you choosing to stay awake when everyone else goes numb.